Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Romarowski. I'm the Executive Director of SPME and ESMIA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar show. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend and colleague, Rona Kaufman. Rona is a prolific scholar and advocate. She is a professor of law at Duquesne at Pittsburgh. She deals with constitutional law, and has been writing and dealing a lot with a lot of the issues that we tackle regarding anti-Semitism, as well as issues regarding the Middle East from a legal standpoint, in addition to everything else she does at large, which we thank her for, beyond her scholarly work. Contrary to what we originally promoted her talk to be, as a result of the attack that happened over the weekend on Iran, and given Rona's experience when it comes to constitutional law issues, she's going to shift her conversation. We're going to shift our conversation this afternoon, the discussion about the constitutional aspect of the attack on Iran. And we'll take it, we'll talk about that, and we'll take it from there, given the timeliness and the debate legally that's happening in the United States and the public discourse about some of these issues. And so we will explore that. And format-wise, as we all know, those of us who've been with us in the past, Rona will talk for about 25 or 30 minutes or so. Then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be via the chat, so type in your questions in the chat after she's done. As always, we promise to do our best to get to all our questions in advance. If we do not, please feel free to email us after the webinar. So really, without further, one more thing, one more worthy point to note. Rona is now in Israel, and so if there are sirens during her talk, which of course we hope that there will not be, and she has to stop her talk, we will take a break and then we will resume. But just giving everybody a heads up on that point as well. So with all that being said, Rona, the virtual floor is now yours, and I thank you again for joining us.
Great. Thank you. I am thrilled to be here. Did it work? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So so something changed over the weekend, as we all noticed. And the United States struck Iran, 3 of its nuclear plants, and immediately, almost immediately, it seems, everyone started having conversations about whether Trump could do this, whether it was constitutional. So as Asaf mentioned, I teach constitutional law at Duquesne, and I was really surprised by a lot of what I was seeing online and how quickly so many people were certain that this was unconstitutional and that it's a basis for impeachment. And so I started educating people really quickly through my Facebook page. And I'm thrilled to just kind of have an opportunity to talk about it more. So that's what we're going to do. So here we go. It's always so weird for me in a webinar when I can't see the people, because I like it better when I have students in person. I'm sure you all do too. In any event, okay, so I'm going to start like this. Basically, let's think about the Constitution and what powers the president has. This is from an article from the Yale Law Review in 2023. And I'll start out by noting that the conventional wisdom is that the Commander-in-Chief clause arms the president with a panoply of martial powers. By some lights, the clause not only equips the president with exclusive control over military operations, but also conveys the power to start wars, create military courts, direct and remove officers, and wield emergency wartime powers. Under such readings, the meaning of commander-in-chief is as obvious as it is unequivocal. It confers some measure of absolute and unchallengeable authority upon the president. Yet, seemingly paradoxically, proponents of this stance cannot say where the commander-in-chief's power begins and ends. In particular, establishing the clause's limits is an acute and persistent problem. So I'm just pointing this part out just to kind of start off this conversation about how it is really generally understood to be a very powerful position that the president is in as commander-in-chief because of the Constitution of the United States. And yet there is a lot of lack of clarity. There's no question that we can have a debate about whether it's constitutional. I will explain why I believe, certainly in the context of today, why this particular strike is absolutely constitutional. I mean, it's just silly, honestly, but it's silly to suggest that the president should be impeached for this. But I want to point out that there really is difficulty in understanding at what point does the president's power end, or when does it exactly begin in terms of its how it works with Congress. So here's what we're going to talk about. We are talking about what is constitutional. And in talking about what is constitutional, obviously we would look at the text of the Constitution. But if you read the Constitution and I read the Constitution and Asaf reads the Constitution, we're going to have at least 3 different opinions about what the Constitution authorizes and what it doesn't authorize. And that is because the text is inherently ambiguous. And so we rely on interpretation. When we talk about constitutional law and what is and isn't constitutional, we're talking about what the Supreme Court has decided is or is not constitutional. And in real time, we all saw how quickly constitutional law can change because the interpretation can change. And we saw that with the most recent Dobbs decision, which, from 1973 until very recently, it was clear that there was a fundamental right to abortion. And since Dobbs, it is now clear that there is no fundamental right to abortion. So I just kind of want to point that out as a reminder and something to have in the back of your minds as we're thinking about whether this is constitutional. I'm today talking about whether it is constitutional today. That doesn't mean that we can't either have a constitutional amendment or that a different Supreme Court or even this Supreme Court could determine that a strike like this would be unconstitutional. But my argument is that based on how the court has addressed this, based on the text, and based on custom and statutory authority, Trump's actions were clearly constitutional in this case. So we'll talk about the text. We'll talk about interpretation. Custom is an interesting piece, and usually custom doesn't come into play when we're trying to interpret actions as either constitutional or not. But because we are dealing with political questions, when we're talking about separation of powers and the powers of Congress and the power of the president, in some cases where there's a political issue, the Supreme Court will refuse to rule. And that is because the Supreme Court recognizes that these are unelected people, that they are unelected, that they have lifetime appointments, that they basically have a different relationship with the American people. And when you're dealing with a political question, they will often refuse to rule on the issue because the political process can answer the issue. Meaning, if people don't like what the president did, if people don't like what their members of Congress did, they don't have to vote for them again. They can vote them out of office, and that's a better solution. And so when we're talking about war powers, there are scenarios where the Supreme Court is going to sit it out. And what we end up seeing is that we really end up relying on custom in this area of law. Custom meaning how Congress and the president share war powers in fact, right? So how do they in fact share war powers? That informs us as to what is and what is not constitutional. And then finally, statutory authority. So there are a few different laws that I'll mention, federal laws, that also impact what the president can and cannot do when it comes to military action where there is no declaration of war. All right, so now we're going back, and I'm taking you back to, like, I don't know, maybe 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, a reminder that we have 3 different branches of government, that we have an executive branch, that's the president. And you'll note on that blue slide that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. We have a judicial branch. I already talked to you about the Supreme Courts, and the judicial branch includes all of the federal courts as well. And we have the legislative branch. And the legislative branch, in addition to making laws, also has the power to declare war, and also has some other foreign policy powers. When we think about these 3 different branches of government and where are their strongest powers, we think of Congress as a lawmaking body. That's the main thing that Congress does. The most important power that Congress has is that it makes the laws. When we think about the judiciary, we think about, well, the judiciary's most important function is interpreting the laws. And when we look at the executive, really, I believe that the most important functions of the executive domestically would be enforcing laws and appointing federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. And then the president of the United States is the one who is generally dictating foreign policy. And that includes his power as commander in chief over the military of the United States. Okay, so if we go to the text of the Constitution, which is one way of determining whether something is constitutional, and we look at Article 1 is generally congressional powers. We know that Congress has the power to declare war and do some other things that we don't usually do anymore, to raise and support armies and to appropriate money. So that is considered a really important power also of Congress over the military, in that Congress could starve the military. Congress could decide not to appropriate significant funding to the military if it doesn't want to allow the military to engage in certain efforts. Same thing with the Navy. It also calls forth militias, and then there's all sorts of rules for that as well. And then Article 2 of the US Constitution talks about the president's powers. And in there, it talks about the president's power as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of course also of the militias. So the Supreme Court has Article 1 and Article 2. Article 1 is telling us that Congress has the power to declare war, and it tells us that it decides how to financially support the military. And Article 2 tells us that the President of the United States is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So what we know is war powers are shared powers. These are powers that are very clearly shared by Congress and the President of the United States. And when the Supreme Court has had to rule on the question of whether the president has certain powers, as it did in Youngstown Sheet and Tube in 1952, it really struggles. And this was actually a case where it said that the president couldn't do what he did, which was actually seizing a steel plant in the United States. It was a domestic action that he took, and he took it and justified it because of his war powers. But the court said, and this is really, I think, powerful language, again, for recognizing that the text of the Constitution, it doesn't give us everything we need to know what is constitutional and what is not. That's why we rely on the justices. So they said here, these cryptic words have given rise to some of the most persistent controversies in our constitutional history, with presidents at various points claiming that it vests power to do anything, anywhere that can be done with an army or navy. Prior to that 1952 case, we have a case from 1866. And here, the Chief Justice then of the Supreme Court said that the Commander-in-Chief Clause enshrines the president's authority, not just over the command of the forces, but also over the conduct of campaigns. So that's a little bit of what we have from the Supreme Court in terms of interpreting the question of what is the role of the Commander-in-Chief. I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to now set us away a little bit from the text of the Constitution. And I want to suggest that even if you're not a constitutional scholar, or even if you are a constitutional scholar, I think that at this particular moment, when we're watching what's going on with this war and with Trump's action in this war, and when I say this war, really, I'm referring to the war between Israel and Iran, because just because there was this strike doesn't mean that there will be a war between the United States and Iran, of course. When we're looking at this, I think that we can also very much rely on what we as Americans understand about how wars are waged in the United States of America. So if you've been following this, you'll see this all over the internet, I think. But basically, the last time that the United States of America declared war, that Congress declared war, was in World War II. So that ended in 1945. And now here we are in 2025. And if you just sit and think for a moment about whether or not we have had military actions since 1945, of course, you know that we have, right? Probably the ones that are most familiar and at front of mind would be Iraq and Afghanistan, but we're also talking about Korea and Vietnam and so many others. And I want to share something. I want to share a different slide with you for a moment to just kind of make this point, okay? So am I still sharing my, let me make sure I'm still sharing it. No, I'm not. Okay.
No, you didn't, you stopped sharing.
Okay. Let me share again. Sorry about that. Okay. So now, well, it's fine. You see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not going to go over these, but I just want to make the point. Okay. So these are military actions since World War II. All right. And this is how many slides of military actions we have since World War II. Okay. So I want you to just think about that in terms of trying to understand the conversations that are being had right now, where people are saying, wow, this strike on Iran, clearly unconstitutional, clearly justification for impeachment. That would suggest that probably every single one of these military actions, or at least many of them, would also have been grounds for impeachment and would also have been unconstitutional. Okay, I'm going back to, did I stop sharing again? Yep, every time I press escape, I'll start sharing in just 1 second again. All right, so we have all of these military actions since World War II. And Congress never declared a war. But we did have other congressional action that took place since basically, since 1945. And so I'll talk to you about a few of them. So the War Powers Resolution is, continue to share, yes. The War Powers Resolution of 1973. Interestingly, this was actually passed to prevent the president from pulling the United States into war without a declaration of war. So, right, we have our Constitution, we have Article 1 and Article 2, we have the Supreme Court saying, well, it seems like the commander-in-chief is really powerful. Sometimes it's not as powerful, other times it is more powerful. And basically, the commander-in-chief took us into the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War, as we all know, ended up being an incredibly entrenched military campaign. Many, many, many American soldiers died. Of course, it was on everyone's televisions, so it really hit home in a way that other wars perhaps had not. And in 1973, Congress adopted the War Powers Resolution of 1973 in order to make it clear that there are limits to how much the president can do without a declaration of war. So the War Powers Resolution says that when there is no declaration of war, the president must report to Congress within 48 hours after introducing U.S. military forces into hostilities, right? So if this would apply right now, then within 48 hours of having struck Iran, the president should be speaking to Congress about it. And then those hostilities must end within 60 days unless Congress passes some type of resolution to allow continued action. It goes on to say that in every possible instance, the president should consult with Congress before introducing hostilities, so if possible, or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and after every such introduction should consult regularly with Congress so that they know what's going on. The resolution also clarifies that Congress believes the president's commander-in-chief powers are limited to hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances and can only be exercised under certain circumstances, right? So this is simply Congress saying, here's our interpretation of the Constitution. Now, whether the War Powers Resolution Act is constitutional is unclear. There are many commentators who say it is not. There are those who say that it is, because whatever's in the Constitution, Congress has no power to limit what's in the Constitution. If the president is granted a power by the Constitution, Congress cannot limit it. So this resolution is Congress saying, just so everyone knows, we believe that the president's power in hostilities is limited and can be exercised only when, one, there's a declaration of war, which in this case we don't have. Two, specific statutory authorization, which we may or may not have in this case, because there are two statutory authorizations that I'll tell you about that may serve as a basis for this strike on Iran. Three, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. We may have that. So three would be a national emergency that's created by an attack. The attack doesn't have to have happened 1 week ago or even 2 weeks ago. But as you probably know, US bases have been hit by proxies of Iran since October 7th. American citizens have been taken hostage by proxies of Iran. The US Embassy in Israel was hit during, I don't know when that was, sometime in the last 10 days, it was hit. And that is a possession of the United States. So number three, I believe that under number three, meaning without a declaration of war and even without specific statutory authorization, that this administration would be justified in taking action against Iran. If you go back before October 7th, Iran and the United States have had a rocky several decades. So some could argue that even before October 7th, there have been many things that have taken place in the relationship between Iran and the United States that would justify this under number three of the exceptions of the War Powers Resolution. So what's interesting about this is that the War Powers Resolution is intended to limit the president's authority, right? The idea being that maybe many people think that the president's authority as commander-in-chief under the Constitution is much broader than this third bullet. And Congress doesn't have the power to dictate what the powers of the president are. That's up to the Constitution. And yet it seems like this War Powers Resolution, which is again a limiting document, in my mind, it only supports this particular strike against Iran under both probably number two, specific statutory authorization, and number three, that there is an emergency created by attack upon the United States. So those other statutes I mentioned, the Congress there are two statutes that remain in effect. They are the authorizations for the use of military force of 1991 and of 2002. And both of them grant the president power to engage in hostilities. The 1991 version gave the president the ability to act against Iraq to enforce United Nations resolutions. And the 2002 statute stated that the president is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. So as you can imagine, the 2002 Act was passed as a response to 9/11, and it gave the president broad authority. And of course, the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan were both waged under the authority of this 2002 authorization. Both of these acts, there are many members of Congress who believe that they are too broad. There are many who believe that presidents of both parties over the last 30 years have abused the power that they were given by Congress. And there are efforts to repeal these laws, but they have not yet been repealed. So under these two laws, I just want to note a series of military actions that were taken. So even after the initial 1991, authorization, and of course the 2002, now we're talking all the way in 2011, and you notice this is not about Iraq. In 2011, Obama ordered a military intervention in Libya without congressional approval, and that lasted 8 months. In 2013, he intervened in the Syrian civil war. Congress refused his request for a specific authorization. And so then he argued that intervention did not require congressional approval because he had the 2002 authorization, which remains in effect today. In 2017, Trump's missile strikes against Syria after chemical warfare, his supporters felt it was permissible under the 2002 law. And Trump argued that the action was allowed under the president's Article 2 powers. That's his power as commander-in-chief. That he was using his power as commander-in-chief to protect the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States. And he doesn't even need to rely on the authorization for use of military force. And then in 2020, he cited the 2002 statute to support his decision to strike Soleimani, the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Al-Quds Force. Biden then also relied on the 2002 Act and the same Article 2 powers, again, also making the point like, hey, Congress, just because I can tell you, like, listen, I'm safe, I'm good, I don't need a declaration of war, I don't need any special statutory authority, because that 2002 law is still good law and it's out there. But also, I don't even need that 2002 law, because by the way, Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States gives me the authority, right? It's just like kind of a covering of all bases. I'm authorized under your 2002 statute, so you certainly have nothing to complain about. And even if you were to complain, I actually don't even need your permission, because the Constitution of the United States directly, explicitly gives me permission because it names me commander-in-chief. And these were attacks on Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the Red Sea. The Biden administration filed reports within 48 hours. So they wanted to, be in a good relationship with Congress. They filed these reports. That is to be, to conform with the requirements of the War Powers Resolution. But they still noted, by the way, like, listen, within 48 hours, we're letting you know, here's the action we took. But by the way, we were acting to protect US citizens, both at home and abroad, in furtherance, same language, of US national security and foreign policy interests. That's the same language that Trump used when he argued that his attack was also justified, not just under the 2002 AUMF, but also by the Constitution itself. And Biden says, I am acting under my power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The Obama administration, during its various actions, insisted that significant use of force without congressional approval is constitutionally permissible because of the historic gloss placed on the Constitution by 2 centuries of practice. So I was only showing you the various military actions that we've been involved in since World War II. But Obama was arguing that, in fact, it is the entire history of the United States when it comes to the way the president is empowered by the Constitution and the way Congress has deferred to the president in this respect that has created a custom. He's calling it this historical gloss placed on the Constitution by these 2 centuries. The administration made this claim explicitly to justify the use of force against Libya. He said, our history is replete with instances of presidential uses of military force abroad in the absence of prior congressional approval. The administration later claimed authority to use force against Syria, also without congressional approval, and also against ISIS. So I mentioned earlier that there are those who would like to repeal both the 1991 and the 2002, and that makes perfect sense because, Congress does. I don't think Congress should be giving away its power to the President of the United States. It certainly, if it has been, one way to undo that would be to repeal these 2 laws. And so after the Senate voted in favor, so the Senate did vote in favor of repealing, but the House did not. He said, our Constitution is clear. Only Congress has the power to declare war, and for too long, Congress has abdicated this most serious responsibility. Administrations of both parties have used these authorizations for the use of military force to justify military action without returning to Congress. And Congress has been happy to sit idly by and avoid taking hard votes. And that's the reality of it. As far as from a political perspective, Congress, individual members of Congress are generally quite happy to not need to be in the position of voting yes or no to declare war, because if their constituents don't like it, they're not going to be reelected. They would generally prefer that the president just go about his business and that the president alone face the political consequences of waging war. So Dick Durbin, recognizes that, like, listen, we need to take some responsibility here, and we will be forced to have to declare war if we want the president to be able to take action. So he said, today that will change. We are one step closer to terminating two outdated authorization for use of military force acts related to Iraq. As one of only 23 senators who voted against one of those back in 2002, it is long overdue. Nevertheless, again, it's still good law. Okay, that is my formal presentation. I'm ready for questions. I'm also putting up on the screen, I guess, ways that you can be in touch with me. Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and my email at work and LinkedIn, if you want to continue the conversation at some point in time offline.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that thorough explanation of where we are. It's obviously there's a lot to unpack here, and obviously, it's critical all around, given where we are. If you don't mind, if you take off the PowerPoint, be able to, for the spotlighting and for the recording.
Great.
For all IT necessary issues, we'll be able to focus on that. Wonderful. So there's a lot to discuss. Alex, I'll let you take out the first question throughout there, and then we'll go to the audience, and I'll let Suzanne manage that. But why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for a very interesting and systematic presentation for all of us non-lawyers, although many of us have studied law on Twitter, so our expertise is clearly the equal of yours, if not greater. As someone who recalls the term police action from my youth and all of that, I have a certain cynicism at this point, and I think a tremendous number of Americans who are not constitutional lawyers, and even those who are constitutional lawyers, are experiencing now. And I point to the domestic situation where district courts across America have taken upon themselves to exercise control of various executive branch functions related to to immigration, visas, other kinds of border issues. Obviously, I also recall at the end of the Biden administration that a new constitutional amendment was conjured out of words regarding the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as student loans were forgiven. I paid off mine, but I guess that doesn't matter. Courts have been unwilling, as you noted, to intervene thus far in some of these foreign policy and war powers issues, because there is a fairly robust architecture beginning with the Constitution itself and moving forward to at least 2002. But have these kinds of issues been undermined by shenanigans that have been exercised in the domestic sphere? Is there a relationship between the domestic sphere and the foreign policy sphere, and how do they interact?
Yeah, it's interesting. Good question, and thank you. All right, here's what I would say. A couple things. First of all, there's a real tension when it comes to separation of powers. Maybe tension's not the right word. We are in transition when it comes to separation of powers. So I think our Constitution is the most brilliant governing document ever. Like, I can't believe these founding fathers, these framers, were able to create such a phenomenal document. Even though the document sometimes is pretty clear about, for example, Congress can make law. The president doesn't get to make law. Congress gets to make law. But as you may know, we have an entire administrative state in the United States of America that really is run by the executive branch, right? So, and we have had this basically since the New Deal era. And Congress, which is supposed to make law, delegated tremendous power to the president to start making laws. All these regulations that are out there that also Trump has actually talked about wanting to get rid of, but all of these regulations that are out there, that's all executive power that was given to the executive by Congress. So now we're talking about domestic, right? We're talking about like the EPA and the what's the Federal Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the CDC, all of those organizations, right? They are all lawmaking essentially because all those regulations function as law. They are all lawmaking organizations run by the executive branch under the president's power. And that is all because Congress delegated tremendous power to the president of the United States. And it started during a time of emergency, right? We're in the Great Depression and FDR needed power to save the country essentially. And the Supreme Court gave it to him. And then that continued to take place for the next 100 years, almost 100 years. Recently, this Supreme Court has been pulling back on that. And it's very interesting because right now we're looking at a presidential action in the foreign policy realm that people are very upset about. But you're asking about the connection between the domestic and the foreign policy to some extent, right? And when it comes to the domestic realm, the conservative court, this very conservative court, is interested in basically no longer allowing the Congress to delegate power to the president, which means the end of the administrative state. Now, the administrative state is really quite important in terms of like just the way our country runs, the way everything is run. So I don't know how that plays out down the line, but we have already seen a series of decisions where this Supreme Court is saying, hey, Congress, you can't delegate power to the president. Like you have to keep your power and the president keeps his power, and that's how it works. Now, how will that work here? For example, the War Powers Resolution. We have this war power. That's exactly what that was. It was meant to be limiting, but it was also granting of power. Like, listen, without a declaration of war, here are the things you can do. And then Congress passes these AUMFs in 1991 and 2002, again, saying, hey, you deal with this war. We're just going to sit here, like report to us. Let us know what's going on. Give us a report every once in a while, but you go. So there are important relationships between, in terms of just interpretation of the Constitution and conservative views of the Constitution, conservative jurisprudential views, more originalist views, and looking really at the text of the Constitution. That's what we have at the Supreme Court. So what's weird about this is that in this particular case, if the Supreme Court I don't see the Supreme Court hearing any of this, but if the Supreme Court was to hear something on this topic, any Supreme Court from the last 60, 70 years would, I believe, most certainly have found this to be a constitutional strike. But this Supreme Court that is very concerned about separation of powers, I don't know how they view the Commander-in-Chief clause and whether they view it as broadly as it has been viewed over these last several decades. If I'm not answering your question, kind of send me in a different direction.
No, I would agree with you, again, as a non-lawyer, that we're in this very contradictory time where conservatives want to repeal the Administrative Procedure Act, moving in that direction with Chevron and other decisions. But the liberals, all the way down to district courts in who knows where, are exercising bizarre sorts of powers, which have no justification. I mean, everybody jokes on social media that they're expecting some district court in Oakland to demand that the administration rebuild all of the Iranian nuclear facilities and things like this. So the streams have been crossed, you might say, with different with politics moving in different and not always predictable kinds of trajectories. But it would seem to me that the accumulation of power in the deep state, to coin a phrase, is something that nobody really wants to give up, really. And
we'll see how this Supreme Court, I mean, this Supreme Court has definitely come out with a few decisions that are making it clear, also a little more in favor of states' rights. And it's weird because sometimes the cases that they're deciding, like politically, if it was about politics, they would be siding with, let's say, the liberals, or I can't even explain it. Sorry. There was a case in California where California had rules about what kind of pigs could be sold in California for food. And it was a very like hippy dippy kind of a law that was trying to protect the way pigs were treated, And the question was whether Congress could, whether Congress's power over interstate commerce included the power to prevent California from having its own law, right? Because that's disruptive of interstate commerce. If in California you can only sell this kind of potato or this, and the Supreme Court was in favor of states' rights. So you're seeing these kind of interesting decisions coming out of the court where the actual decision itself is very like popular maybe with the left, but the reasoning behind the decision is really very conservative thinking, that it's more pro-state rights, and it's also more concerned with going back to the way it was before the New Deal when it comes to separation of powers.
There's an interesting question here. If I don't mean to monopolize here.
You want to turn over to the want to go on the Q&A, Alex? One second.
Well, I just want to note one question that Iran apparently has fired a half dozen missiles at the U.S. base in Qatar, as we've been speaking here. So when does this become a war? And this is not simply a semantic issue. Now that they've retaliated for an act that is within the president's power, what's the next level? How does it go up from here? If the U.S. retaliates or becomes more fully involved in this conflict now that Iran has attacked?
Under number 3, right? If the president is always authorized under the War Powers Resolution, under number 3, if we are directly attacked, the president can respond, and certainly he does not need congressional approval. So, which is interesting, right? So like if they're responding because we struck, does that change whether he's allowed to respond? No, it doesn't. I mean, if the US is under threat, and we should hope that this would be true, the commander in chief needs to be able to, if we wait for Congress, I mean, you've seen that, how they operate over there, right? If we wait for Congress, if we were counting on Congress, like if an act of Congress had to save my life, I would not be saved, right? So we can't, I mean, Congress is slow, incredibly slow, and they're fighting all the time. And, so we need to have a commander in chief who can actually take action when there is a real threat. And so, yeah, could this turn into a war? Of course it could turn into a war. Of course it could turn into a war. At some point, at that point, probably Congress would give him the authorization he needs, because at the end of the day, I mean, I hope that our members of Congress want to protect us. And if US military bases are going to be under attack, I would think that they would give the authorization.
And the game will continue.
Okay, I'll shut up from here and just watch everything unfold. So
yeah, on Twitter, where we get all our information from. All right, let's go to the audience for a second and see, and try to tackle some of these questions here.
Yeah.
Suzanne, do you want to tackle some of these questions in the audience? Suzanne?
I see one from Mark Cohen.
Yeah, I know. I just want to see if Suzanne is going to tackle this. She not answering or not? Okay, well, wait. If there's technical issues, I'll tackle it. Okay, so let's go to Mark's question here and see. So he obviously agrees with the decision to bomb, the sites in Iran. But from a constitutional point, do you view this, is it, do you view to afford the president the broad power, and do we risk imbuing the president with too much power? I mean, again, to your questions about powers.
So apparently, we as a country have decided that we are comfortable with the President of the United States having very broad military power. And right now, it looks like we are rethinking that. So, which is interesting. This is a really important question. Should the president have the power to engage in military action that could draw the United States into a long, difficult war where many American lives could be lost? Why we weren't asking those questions publicly, like as in a community, why that wasn't part of the public discourse really so much before. I mean, we heard about it during the Iraq War, but this is an important question and we should be answering it. The answer up until now has been, we believe that the president of the United States should have that authority, that we trust this person. I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a president that many, many Americans do not trust on a deeply human level. They don't respect him. They don't trust him. They think he's crazy. They think he would sell us out. And so now that question is easier to ask that question. When it was a president that they really trusted, they weren't asking the question. I think also we saw that even with Biden now. I mean, I think this new book that came out, Jake Tapper and whoever wrote it, about Biden being mentally incompetent, basically, during his presidency, this is a good time to be asking these questions. I don't know the answer. I do know that we cannot wait for, I mean, if we have a dysfunctional Congress, then we need someone to be able to protect the country and to engage in military strikes when they are needed. I think this is a question we'll continue to discuss as a country now.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to Deborah Rudy's question. So Deborah is pointing out correctly, with all the precedent that you laid out correctly, a president using their authority to make military decisions without congressional approval, is the current resolution being considered in the Senate to call it unconstitutional, more of a political move, given everything that you've laid out properly?
Okay, so let me start with a question because I didn't look at news today. What is I know that people are saying, oh, we need to impeach him. What is the resolution that just now was introduced in Congress? It's just a declaration that his actions are unconstitutional. Is that what they're doing? Do you know?
Last I checked, Alex, I know the exact verbiage of what, but that's part of it. I mean, there was if I remember correctly,
I mean, people like AOC are saying it's unconstitutional,
unconstitutional.
but there's
Yeah.
no analytical rigor to that.
I mean, AOC is a member of Congress, so people listen to her more than other people, but people saying that it's unconstitutional,
Right.
it doesn't mean anything. That's the judiciary's job.
Right. There was a whole to do with Adam Schiff yesterday
Okay.
that was going on, making the argument that it was unconstitutional and the fact that, the powers and that he didn't share. Basically, it was a lot of whining about why we didn't get to know about it in advance and kind of aggregating too much powers, on a lot of the talk show, on Sunday morning. But that's a lot of where we've seen that.
Congress has power. Congress can address it through funding by denying funding to the military. That's one thing that Congress can do. I imagine a lawsuit can be brought against this administration. I think that that would be a fail. I don't see how that can address this issue. They can impeach him if they want to impeach him. I don't think that this falls into any of the categories of impeachment. I mean, they're talking about treason. I don't see it, but Congress can do things like that. We do need, I guess, it would be nice to have more clarity as to where the powers of the commander-in-chief end and where the power, it's not true, where Congress's power is exactly and where the commander-in-chief power is exactly. And the only body that can answer that question is the Supreme Court of the United States. So a suit could be brought about this strike, and the Supreme Court could rule on that and say, yes, this is within the power of the commander-in-chief, or no, it is not.
Great. Let me move on to a few other questions here. There is a question asking about, and again, this is a little bit, goes out of the realm of the Constitution, but if the President of the United States has legal power to declare war on Iran, how does that relate to his power to supersede the UN? I mean, and how does, is there, relationship there as far as sovereign states is there a relationship there that supersedes one over the other regarding the United Nations?
Okay, so first of all, the president does not have the legal power to declare war on Iran, right? The president ordered a strike on Iran, but the president cannot declare war on Iran. Iran may have taken that strike as a declaration of war, as the action, just taking that action as that, but president's not declaring war. As far as violating, let's say, treaties that the U.S. is a party to,
Yeah.
the U.S. has violated other UN rules as well, and the U.S. generally doesn't get in trouble for that because it's the United States of America, and it's a political answer to that question, really, which is, what can the U.S. do? The U.S.
No,
can probably do whatever it wants.
whatever it wants. No, that's all good. Just the body of the United Nations in itself is a whole other lecture on its own and what it actually does or does not do. But thank you for that. Alex, let me go back to your earlier question. I'll take it back to you.
I remain a cynic. And that's not a reflection on your presentation, but it does go back to one of my core concerns, having grown up in the 60s and 70s and seen the decline in the interest and respect in following the actual text of the Constitution as opposed to the conjured living text of the Constitution. And I guess my question is to you as a law professor, and as a person involved in Jewish affairs, not least of all, how do you think American society is situated to restore understanding of what the Constitution actually says, how the law really works?
Yeah.
And where do we go from here? You gave us a very nice, concise kind of introduction to this particular issue, which I don't think most people have, and the interest, I'm not sure, is there. So what do we do?
So we need civics classes in middle school. It is devastating that Americans don't know what the Constitution says, and I see it because my students come in first year of law school and they don't know, and you hear people all the time, my First Amendment rights against my employer, against somebody I have a contract. You don't have First Amendment rights you have First Amendment rights against the government. Like, there are so many basic things about our Constitution, about the structure of our government, that most Americans do not understand. We know that our education system is totally failing in terms of what Americans are learning, just really about science and math and reading. I think I read recently that something like over 40% of Americans have a third grade reading level. We need to be teaching these things. We need to be teaching the Constitution. I want to go back to another thing that you had mentioned about your concerns. And I want to point out that, the solution when we don't like what the president of the United States does is to not vote for that guy. And the bigger problem that we have is that we're living in an incredibly polarized moment. And it's not just in the United States, right? It's really across democracies across the world. People are so polarized. So whichever side they're on, they don't view this president as their president. And they don't view anything that president does as legitimate. And they're very fearful of what that president does, right? So if you believe that Trump is not legitimate, basically, should not be the president of the United States, and is engaging in a war that could draw us into a war, it's very, very troubling. And the politicians are really feeding this, like when Roe v. Wade was overturned, Biden made a comment that I was really upset about when he said like the court went rogue. And he really undermined the authority of the Supreme Court. And I disagree. I think our Supreme Court is still the same Supreme Court it has always been. I understand the people have changed, but the Supreme Court has always been a tricky place. And it's always a pendulum swing from left to right. There was no surprise about the decision overturning Roe v. Wade. It was an understandable, reasonable interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution is ambiguous. There is nothing we can do to everything is, words are ambiguous. Contracts are ambiguous. We need judges to interpret what it means. It's not that our Constitution's not written well enough and that's why we're in this situation. We're in this situation because we are so polarized that people can't come together and say, okay, listen, we trust our court to interpret this document, and sometimes they will interpret it in a way that I, Rona Kaufman, this particular citizen agrees with, and sometimes they won't, but we're all in this together, and we're not there anymore. You know, like people think he's not legitimate, he's not really president, he has no business, and so therefore this strike is outrageous. Hillary Clinton said she would have struck Iran if she became president of the United States. You know, Obama was very involved in military actions in the Middle East, as was Biden. But it's so politicized. If another president would have done this, I don't think you would have the same level of panic. It's because of the polarization. It's because people don't trust him. I mean, I'm deeply thankful that this strike took place, and that's totally separate from my constitutional analysis of this. It wouldn't have mattered which president took which action against any country. I mean, I actually am fearful because if we end up with a president that hates Israel, I'm terrified because I recognize that the president of the United States manages our foreign policy and is the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. That is big power. We shouldn't take it lightly. The fact that in a country of over 350 million people, we can't seem to find decent candidates for president is a problem. We have a major internal problem that we should be solving. This isn't a constitutional problem. This is a people problem and a politics problem and a polarization problem and probably a TikTok problem that I hope we're going to solve.
That's a bigger issue on China and Russia, but yes, correct. That's a good place to to end, and we thank you for your time, Rona. There's obviously a lot here, and obviously the timeliness of your presentation is very much appreciated. Obviously, I hope you come back at a later time. I hope you're staying safe, and obviously, get back home safely. And obviously, we'll look forward to continuing the conversation. As always, I want to thank my colleagues for joining us, Suzanne and Alex, this afternoon, and to everybody who joined us this afternoon on the webinar. Please be on the future lookout for future webinars, and we will talk soon. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.